Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Pillsworth. She is professor of anthropology at California State University, Fullerton. Her research questions include patterns of mate preferences, mate choice, sexuality, gender, romantic love, and reproduction. And today we're going to talk about the Shuar, which is basically a group of hunter horticultural people in South America, partner choice and marital practices, parent-offspring conflict, mate preferences, parental investment, coupling, women's sexual strategies, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Pillsworth, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
So tell us about the Shuars. Who are these people? And tell us a little bit about their society generally.
Sure. Well, first, one of the things that you should know is that they are one of many indigenous nationalities in South America, and particularly in Ecuador. The Shuar live both in Ecuador and in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
They are, in Ecuador, the second largest indigenous nation. So there's approximately 110,000, by some estimates, Shuar people living today, across 3 different provinces in Ecuador, and as I said, on into Peru. They have so when we say that they are hunter horticulturalists, so first of all, for your viewers who may not know those terms, horticulture, so we can talk about subsistence strategies that differ in terms of how much we're relying on resources that occur naturally in the environment and how much we're producing resources.
Mm-hmm.
So hunter-gatherers get all of their resources from resources that are occurring naturally in the environment. They're not cultivating plants as a general rule. They're not domesticating animals or keeping animals. Hunter horticulturalists rely on hunting primarily for protein sources. And horticulture means that they are not just gathering, although they do a lot of gathering in the rainforest, but they are also cultivating plants. So the women maintain gardens. Their primary crops are manioc, sweet manioc, not bitter manioc, which requires a lot more processing, plantain, and a variety of other plants that they grow through planting, through propagating, through even sharing. They have vast networks of sharing networks of the propagules that they use for their plants, which is work by one of my colleagues, Dr. Brenda Bowser. So there's a very strong interdependence between men and women in terms of resource acquisition, in terms of subsistence. The family organization, one of the things that you should know about the Shuar also is that they really have a very recent history of acculturation, as recently as the 1950s and 1960s. Prior to that, the Shuar didn't live in settled communities really at all. They lived in independent households throughout the rainforest, and they had alliances amongst these individual households, generally individual men. And so these alliances could be due to kinship or reciprocal relationships. And the households typically were composed of a man with his wife or wives, and I'll get back to that in just a second, and their children, and possibly a new son-in-law, or 2 might be around. So in terms of numbers of wives, if we look at the earlier ethnographies of the Shuar, we look at historical accounts from Shuar community members themselves, in the very recent past, again, as recently as in the 1950s and 60s, and really up until nearly the 21st century, the Shuar could be characterized as most men had 2 to 3 wives. So this is an interesting figure, right? Because if we expect that on average, populations have relatively equal numbers of males and females, if we have a majority of males having 2 to 3 wives, that means mathematically we have a lot more women than we do men, approximately 2 to 3 times as many women as we do men. And the reason for this was that in historic Shuar communities, there was a really high rate of inter-individual and intergroup violence, very high rate of homicide, one of the highest homicide rates on the planet, even today, although fortunately it's reduced substantially. But that is the traditional context. As I said, this really didn't start to change very much at all until about the 1950s and 60s, at which time the Shuar started to concentrate into centros, into communities, which could range in size from just a couple of households to up to several hundred individuals, although those larger sizes really more recently. And this was in part in order to provide themselves with political protection and the ability to interact with the Ecuadorian government. And so that's the context in which the Shuar have been living for the past half century plus. I lose track of the dates. I think it's still like 1988 or something. And so now they live primarily in centros. They still practice to some extent polygamy, but the rates of polygamy are declining substantially. But they still primarily subsist with hunting and horticulture. Women still produce the bulk of the food that people eat every day. Hunting is becoming scarcer and harder to really sustain. So we see a lot more wage labor, whether that's through contract labor or through salaried positions. A lot of men in the villages where I work, in the communities where I work, are actually employed as teachers, and a growing number of women as well. And that's a government paid job. So that's a very reliable income. And so we're seeing these kinds of economic changes, which then also changes the ways that people contribute to the household. But we'll get into that probably more further down.
Sure. So yeah, let's try to keep some of the aspects that you mentioned there in mind when exploring some specific aspects of their society. But okay, so among all of that, what are the aspects of their society, their sociality that you've studied the most or focused the most on?
Yeah, so my primary area of study is related to reproductive and mating strategies. So that includes studying both the traditional and the current marriage norms and behavior, sexual norms and behavior, and parenting norms and behavior. I have done quite a bit of research on mate preferences. And in fact, a little bit later, I'll tell you about the follow-up study I'm doing, working on getting, gosh, it's now like 20-year follow-up data on people I interviewed when they were unmarried as part of my dissertation research. So that's, anyway, it's gonna be really cool because looking at how their mate preferences actually played out. I have recently been focusing on parent-offspring conflict and mating decisions, as well as women's mating and reproductive strategies. What are the choices that they're making? What are the strategies that they're utilizing? And also reproductive behavior in general. So in terms of things like the utilization of birth control or other forms of traditional family planning,
Mhm.
the nursing behaviors, weaning behaviors, and pregnancy and childbirth norms and behaviors. So those are the main things that I've been studying. Other things that I don't have much or any systematic data on, but I pay a lot of attention to while doing fieldwork because I'm really deeply interested in them, are issues related to the sexual division of labor, gender norms, perceptions of sexuality, in particular in terms of uh, perceptions of sexuality diversity, including LGBTQ plus issues,
Mhm.
and women's lives in general, all the things that women do and the struggles and challenges and powers that they have, all of those things, and cultural change. So those are some of the things that I pay attention to, but haven't really collected any data on.
Mhm. So we're going to get more into that later on, but I mean, just for a brief question about all of what you said there, when it comes to the gender norms specifically, uh, with the economic changes that you described there, have you seen any, I mean, important differences over time in terms of how gender norms might have changed?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know that I would even go so far as to say gender norms have changed,
Okay.
but certainly in terms of, for example, I think that the idea of what makes men men and what makes women women
Hmm.
um, is still pretty similar to what people have described to me from the past, and what I've read from the past. Um, but what's changed is, in particular, what's expected in terms of rights for women, what women
Okay.
are allowed to do, are what's the word I'm looking for? Um, are owed essentially as humans, right?
Hmm.
Not as anything, some special category, but just
Hmm.
that this idea of women's rights
Hmm.
really has changed. So if we look at, Shuar traditional practices, um, they're very it was an extremely patriarchal society. Men absolutely dominated in terms of both with physical domination, right? So beating of women was common. Men absolutely controlled women with force and children as well. Um, and women did not have any explicitly, or very little, I should say, explicitly recognized influence. Now, of course, as women do in all places and in all times, this is not to say that women were passive
Hmm.
or that they had no power or influence. One of the things that I have written about a little bit is women's the sources of resistance that are available to women, as well as the areas in which they are able to exert influence, in which they're able to shape the society as well. It's just that those things are much more under what's what I'm learning. What How am I trying to say that? Much less explicit, much less
Hmm.
publicly recognized, um, undercover a little bit.
Hmm.
So that has changed quite a bit, right? There has been a substantial increase in education for everybody across the board, but particularly
Hmm.
for girls and women. So of the women approximately my age, so I'm 50-ish, women my age in the Shuar communities, most of them have about a third grade education. Um, And a lot of them, my age or a little bit older, are illiterate. Um, However, if you look at women just a little bit younger than me, so we're looking at women in their 40s, in their 30s, we're seeing gradual increases in the amount of education at this point, most girls are staying in school through the completion of high school.
Mhm.
And many are going on to college. So that has been a huge change. Again, that's been in some ways across the board. So boys have also been doing more schooling, but the effect is much more dramatic in terms of girls. And this has very, very huge impacts on how their lives unfold. So again, when we're talking about, and I reference my own age because this is, again, it's just, to me, it's so significant of how recent this history is,
Mhm.
that again, women my age, almost all of them were married by the age of 12 without having had any say in that marriage, without having any expectation of it. There, the story that's told to me again and again is I was out, playing or doing whatever, working in the garden. My parents called me and said, "You're going to marry this guy." And then what? And so that's so recent. Like I said, that's all the women my age.
Mhm.
But now the girls are mostly at least finishing high school, so that's pushing back that age of marriage a little bit. Surprisingly, the actual age of marriage hasn't changed, average age of marriage hasn't changed that much in my sample over the years, but in part that's because there are some outliers at both ends. So
Mhm.
amongst the older women, my sample sizes are so small, right? In the community where I've collected the most data, where I collected complete marital and pregnancy histories of all the women in that community, that sample size was, let me look, I think I had, hold on a second, I'll tell you exactly. 20, no, it was 30 in total, 30 married women and one unmarried woman. So that's, that's my sample size. So I have, of the older cohort, most of them are getting married, as I said, at around 12 or 13. But then there's one woman who didn't get married really at all until she
Mhm.
was in her late into her 20s. So she was fully adulthood at that point. And that pulls that average up. And then amongst my younger cohort, the average age is closer to 17 or 18.
Mhm.
But there's a few who ran off and got married at 13. So when you look at the average, it doesn't look like there's been that much change, but there really has, if you're looking at the median, changes pretty
Mhm.
significantly.
So we'll come back to gender roles later in our conversation, but just to follow perhaps a sort of a script here. So starting with partner choices and marital practices. So how do partner choices work in Shuar society? I mean, who chooses there, who does the choices? And I mean, how does marriage look like? Of course, you mentioned earlier that at least until recently, historically speaking, most marriages were polygynous specifically, right? So, but we can get into how that changed over time. But tell us first about partner choice.
Yeah, so again, I always have to, whenever I'm describing anything in terms of Shuar relationship practices, I do have to sort of make this caveat. I talk about traditionally, which was pretty recently,
Hmm.
and today.
Yeah,
So
sure.
traditionally, partner choice was almost entirely a negotiation between men. What would typically happen is, so remember I said that people mostly were living in independent households, not
Yeah.
in communities. And a man would come of age, which when I say of age would have been about 15, 16, 17-ish. And he would go out in search of potential wives. And if in he, and he very well might have information from kin or other people he knows. But he also might literally have just gone out searching. If he finds a girl, and again, traditionally, girls might have been married off very in childhood. They were not expected to engage in any sexual behavior before the onset of menses, anyway. Um, but they might be married off at childhood, even in infancy. Again, in terms of because these relationships were negotiated between men and they were these alliances between men, sometimes a father would promise his future daughters even. So some girls would be married even before they were born. Um, and so basically, so the young man would be out looking for potential brides. If he found one that he thought was appropriate, he would approach her father. And it was so traditionally also the Shuar had a very ritualized form of greeting and meeting when you approached another man's house. That's referred to as strong talking, where the men would partially threaten one another, partially give their genealogy to situate their relatedness or their network connections. And this was then when it was concluded. Well, the indication that was concluded is in the man of the house would call to his wife to bring chicha. So sorry, I'm giving another aside. Chicha is manioc beer. I will come back to it later, but for now, I'll just say it's very important to Shuar cultural practices. And women are in charge of making chicha and having chicha, but men control to whom it's given and when.
Okay.
Traditionally. So the potential son-in-law would make his case to the potential father-in-law. He would go hunting, bring some game back. Now, there are descriptions in the earlier ethnographies that the daughter herself would basically signal her acceptance of this young man when she would cook the food and bring it to him.
Okay.
In my experience, in my interviews with women, I do not get the sense that they had much room for choosing not to serve the man food. And in fact, I have many stories of women and their conflicts with their parents, of either them running away and their parents retrieving them, or them refusing and their parents forcing them. Again, of the women in my sample where I have these full marital histories, only one of those who had whose parents chose her partner, only one of them said she actually came to agree to it before they were married. So I don't know how much leeway girls had in the past, but I would bet not a whole lot. Again, girls and their mothers might have had some influence if they had strong reasons against this person. But in the end, fathers basically made the decision. So go ahead.
Let me just ask you one question, because you already mentioning how much power the parents of the women had over their partner choices, but what about the parents of the men? Did they also play a
Yeah.
role there or not?
Nope. Nope.
No,
Not at
no
all.
influence.
No, no, no. This is entirely a negotiation between a potential son-in-law and a potential father-in-law.
Okay.
And this was very much about them forming an alliance. So again, there were very high rates of intra and intergroup warfare. So having allies was really important. Now, man might be able to also get another ally via his son-in-law. So it could be that, if he gets his son-in-law and maybe his potential son-in-law's dad is very powerful, and then he has sort of an ally through that. But the parents of the sons really didn't have much to do with this,
Okay.
except to the extent that, again, that might be part of those negotiations. So let's say, for example, that a young man comes looking for a wife. If he has sisters and I have, as the dad, I have sons, right? That might be part of the negotiation that, I'll give you my daughter, but you need to give me one of your sisters for one of my sons. So to that extent, they might have some influence in it, but generally, other than that, no real decision making.
Okay. But when it comes to marriage, since at the very beginning you mentioned that most marriages were polygynous, I mean, between a man and two or three women. I mean, I was trying to understand because, of course, it seems that status also played a role in Shuar society, right? I mean, the status of the particular man who is making a marriage offer to the father of the woman he wants to marry. So I mean, how does that work exactly? Because if most, I'm not sure what percentage we're talking about here, but if you say that most marriages were between one man and two or three women, I mean, how low in the social ranking, let's say, would the father of the woman be willing to go when accepting an offer? Because I mean, it couldn't be that, like, I don't know, for example, I'm just putting a number out there, 70% of men were high ranking. Right.
So I don't think you can really think of it in terms of this hierarchical ranking,
Okay.
because again, they weren't organized into a community. So it's really about individual warriorship.
Okay.
And so there's very little, well, again, knowing that somebody has a powerful shaman as a father or a powerful warrior as a father is important information, but it's not like there's inherited status rankings.
Okay.
And being the son of a formidable warrior doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a formidable warrior, and your status will be based on your warriorship. And that's really where what's determining status is, really we can think about it almost very directly as warriorship. To use John Patton's terms for, how he worked in a neighboring population. So not the Shuar, but the Achuar, who actually these two nationalities were very much warring with one another as well. So they both of them experienced intra-group warfare, but also between these two groups, particularly very high rates of warfare. And so, yeah, so status was really very much about one's prowess in terms of warriorship. And this was displayed by, one of the features that the Shuar have been well known for is that they are the ones who made the shrunken heads, the Sansa. And that was really how a man could, well, here are the ways that he could indicate his status, the number of Sansa he had, the number of wives he had, and the amount of chicha he had. Those are the big ones. There were many other things as well, but those were the really big status markers.
So you've already mentioned chicha twice. So what is that exactly?
So chicha is incredibly important. It is, as I said, it's actually manioc beer, so it's a fermented drink made with this sweet manioc root. And it is the core, both food, beverage, and social context. Social, it's really created all the social contexts. So chicha is it's really complicated in talking about. It's simple to describe. It's fermented manioc beer, which is made by mashing. I have made chicha several times. Mashing the manioc, chewing the hard roots of it's the sort of vein of the manioc, chewing that and spitting that back in, stirring it all together, mashing, chewing, spitting, mashing, chewing, spitting, all that. And then you let it ferment. And it can range dramatically in alcohol content. There's very sort of everyday weak chicha, and there's much stronger chicha for parties or for guests. Children drink chicha. Chicha is, traditionally that was the staple food. And I was, when I talk to my friends in Shuar communities whose only experience with beer is this very sort of watered down Pilsner that's the national beer of Ecuador. And I tell them that beer is my people's chicha. And I tell them the history, and I'm like, no, really, in Northern Europe, beer in the Middle Ages, beer was food. It was how you saved your grains. And this is the same thing. That's a way that they can keep those roots and keep them from rotting. So it serves very much the same purpose. And then, as I said, it's also because it's incredibly labor intensive to produce. So first and all of the labor that goes into making chicha, all of it is women's work, with the one exception of clearing the gardens originally. So again, we're in primary rainforest here. Men usually clear out the garden, but women plant the yucca. They harvest the yucca, which is quite difficult to pull these big tuber roots up out of the ground. They transport the yucca in janginas. These are baskets that are, like 50 pounds of yucca root in them that they carry on their heads. Not on their heads, with a strap around their head on their back. Washing that, then they have to boil it. Peeling it is a whole activity in and of itself. And the Shuar women they have their machetes, and they're just like peeling and throwing. I almost cut my hand off several times. I am not very competent at this. And then the boiling it, the mashing, and the chewing, and this takes all afternoon to do. Just the making of the chicha itself, not the harvesting and et cetera, et cetera. So it's incredibly time and labor intensive, and it's all women's labor, which is why chicha is such a good indicator of a man's status, right? So men's status relies on chicha. The more chicha he has, the better the chicha is, the quicker women are able to bring the chicha out. The fact that he has enough on hand that he doesn't run out, all of that is a measure of his status. So it's really interesting how much this thing that's entirely produced by women is this massive component of men's status.
But by the way, does it taste good? How does it
I love
compare?
chicha.
How does it
Um,
compare to other common alcoholic beverages in the West, for example?
well, it's quite a bit chunkier as a general rule. So it's thick and it's usually got quite a lot of fibers in it, although usually when women serve it, they wring out the fibers, so it'll be mostly liquidy, but it can be still quite thick and fairly fibrous. Um, it's kind of sour. I admit that the first couple times I tried it, I didn't like it that much. But now it's like I crave it and I get so excited. I'm like, I go back to Ecuador and I'm like, can I have some chicha? I miss the chicha. It's so good. And then, we've been doing, so a lot of people recently have been starting to look at gut microbiomes because, I
Mhm.
mentioned the chewing. And so this is some work that my sadly recently departed colleague John Patton was doing, and other people are doing it in other places as well. But he was looking at how the gut microbiomes of individuals in this case Achuar and Quechua communities, how that was affected by basically chicha consumption. It turns out that it's really good for, basically sharing these gut microflora that are really helpful. So anyway, but I love it. I think it's really good. And there's a very wide range of chicha styles and
Mm.
quality. A study that I have been wanting to do for a long time is essentially a blind taste test. Um, because everybody's very open about the fact that there's different qualities of chicha, and everybody knows, this woman makes really good chicha and this woman makes not so great chicha. But there's not very good consensus on what qualities would predict which women would make good chicha. And from an evolutionary perspective, we have a couple of competing hypotheses, right? It could be that men are picking up on chemical cues of fecundity and fertility, right? So that
Mm.
we would expect that the chicha that's produced by younger women with more reproductive potential ahead of them would be preferred. However, there's also pretty good argument that practice and experience actually make for better chicha. So there's also a prediction that actually men would probably, or everybody on average, might prefer the chicha of older women. And then there's, MHC predictions. Maybe men prefer the chicha of women who are more distantly related to them, and women maybe prefer the chicha of women who are more closely related to them. So there's all sorts of predictions that we could test. And I'm dying to do this. And one of these days I'll get around to it.
By the way, can you find chicha anywhere outside of Ecuador?
Yes, so chicha is widely produced throughout South America, but it
Mm.
differs really dramatically in different places, and it's made both by highland populations and lowland populations,
Mm.
and with different kinds of core ingredients. So in some places it's made with um, maize, in other places it's made with oh my gosh, all sorts of things. Bitter manioc in Brazil, I think, but that
Mm.
requires a whole different process. Corn, and then even in Shuar communities, they have multiple different kinds of chicha, and some of them are really special for special occasions. So there's chicha de chonta, which is made with the chonta palm. That is a very special occasion chicha. Um, I'll make chicha with maduros, which are uh, basically bananas, but it's the plantains that have become yellow and sweet.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so there's all sorts of different kinds of chicha. Um, but Shuar chicha is primarily sweet manioc.
Okay, so to get back on track,
I get very excited about Cheetah.
yeah, no, and it seems interesting to me. I mean, I'm not much of a person who likes alcohol, but yeah, if it tastes good, yeah, I'm there. So uh, about parent-offspring conflict, because earlier
Mhm.
when we were talking about partner choice, of course, in the case of men, that's one of the reasons why I asked you if the parents of the men also play the role there. You said they don't really, so that doesn't matter really there. But when it comes to the women, there are, of course, some women, as we should expect, that do not like their father's choices. And so, how does parent-offspring conflict play out there?
Yeah, so this is my really big interest currently, as I'm very interested in the idea of parent-offspring conflict, and where the really interesting research questions are. So, the first thing is that, well, the very first thing that I want to say is that parent parental choice, parents being involved at all in offspring mating decisions, is a derived trait. It's a really human trait. We don't see it basically in any other animal that I know of, where any third party has any sort of vested interest in somebody else's mating decisions. So to that extent, we need to think about this as very much related to the human mating context, and the really specific challenges of the human mating context.
Mhm,
So in terms of the parent-offspring conflict, the general concepts, this goes right back to, Triver's parent-offspring conflict paper, which has to
mhm,
do with the fact that, of course, children should want as much of their parents' investment and resources as they can possibly get because it's related to their own reproductive success. And parents, of course, should be trying to distribute their investment and resources across their offspring in order to get the most reproductive benefit to themselves. Because of this, we also should expect that if we're talking about preferences for a mate, for an offspring, that on average, parents and offspring are going to have pretty large overlap in their interests. It's not massive conflict of interest because if a daughter's maximizing her own reproductive potential, this should, on the whole, benefit the parent's reproductive success as well.
mhm,
Now, of course, there's a bunch of caveats to that, that make it not work out so nicely. So first of all, there's not complete overlap. Daughter's fitness is only a small piece of parents' overall fitness. And the relative weight to their fitness of her reproductive success is going to depend on a whole bunch of factors, including things like how many offspring they have. Is she the only one that their entire fitness is resting on, or is she one of 10? That's going to make a difference. The relative impact, the relative influence on the parents' own fitness
mhm,
of their individual children's reproductive success compared to the direct benefits that they could potentially get from these mating decisions is going to also affect how big that gap, that conflict of interest is. Um, and there's a whole bunch of ways that parents should be interested in the mating choices of their offspring that aren't directly related to the potential reproductive success of their offspring, but instead are
mhm,
related to some of the things that we've already talked about, alliance uh, opportunities. So the alliance value of a potential son-in-law is going to be really, really important to a father's direct fitness,
mhm,
whereas it might have very little impact on the daughter's reproductive success. Um, I mentioned mating opportunities. So again, there might be through these alliances, and we see this cross-culturally in all sorts of places, especially where we see arranged marriages. Part of what parents are maximizing is those social benefits, the network benefits, mating opportunities for their other children, and enhancing kinship ties. Other factors that will affect this would be things like the parents, particularly the dad's age. So is he still reproductively competitive, or is he now just trying to get the reproductive benefits from his children? If he's still reproductively competitive, which again, because men can reproduce throughout their lifetimes, he probably is, he can also gain direct benefits by arranging his daughter's marriage and getting potentially other mates for himself or his children. And of course, the resources that mates of offspring can bring to the parents or the siblings of that offspring that's going to partner up. Now, all of those costs and benefits differ from one context to the other, and this is part of why we see such really different effects of parental influence on offspring mate choice and different patterns of parental influence. So in the Shuar context, we expect in the traditional context, this probably would have been, near the extreme end of conflicts of interest, because there were particularly between fathers and daughters. So again, this is a really gendered argument because we're not seeing the same thing at all on the side of men's mating choices, right? So this is really about the conflict of interest between fathers and daughters. And there's several factors that make it more beneficial to fathers to prioritize their own interests over their daughters. One of those is that there's extreme reproductive skew, meaning that, again, because of this general polygamy, if most men had 2 or 3 wives, that means that most men had 2 to 3 times the reproductive success of any individual woman. Now, usually these things even out because, again, the average number of offspring for men should be the same as the average number of offspring for women, since each child has one parent of each sex. But we're missing a lot of men. So we have, this idea that your sons really are either going to have like 3 times the reproductive value of your daughters, or they're going to be dead. Right, is really from the parental perspective what you're looking at. But that means that, you're not thinking as much about the daughter's reproductive success. It's about, how can I get these direct benefits to myself or my sons? There's also, as I just mentioned, that what led to that is there's a highly discrepant sex ratio. So there's far more women than there are men. So again, we should expect that dad's interests are going to be dramatically at odds with daughters, in terms of what they're going to be prioritizing. If fathers could gain allies or mates for themselves or their sons, those benefits likely would have outweighed what really would have been sort of marginal cost, possibly dramatic cost, but probably more marginal costs or decrements to daughter's fitness, certainly to her happiness, right? If she's being married off to somebody that she doesn't care about, she doesn't have a connection with, she's not going to be terribly happy. And here I have to take another side note to talk about the relationship between happiness and fitness. Because of course we know that natural selection, it's not necessarily maximizing happiness, it's maximizing reproductive fitness. But those things aren't totally orthogonal, right? Happiness, what is happiness? Happiness is often influenced by the presence of a cooperative or supportive others, feeling safe, secure, freedom from fear or hardship, right? So all of those things are likely to actually have very measurable, real benefits to reproductive success too.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, it's true that happiness isn't what, leads to fitness. It does, it's important. And if we have, daughters or women in general who are just, miserable and being traded as chattel, that does have an impact on their own reproductive success. But in this context, the impact on their reproductive success of that is likely to be much smaller than the impact on their dad's fitness of being able to get these alliances and these network ties. In addition, as I said, this was traditionally an extremely patriarchal society. So there's, again, strong conflict of interest between um, the fathers and daughters, in that the daughters weren't really expected to have any autonomy, any say. Again, as I said before, as in all societies, women, even though women were definitely subordinated, right? They were regularly beaten, they were traded as property, and they were basically wholly at the command of their husband. But as in all societies, Shuar women also both had both the means of resistance and also ways of influencing their society. And some of the things that really affected that, their ability to resist, are things like, for example, in Amazonian horticultural societies, women have really a great deal of physical autonomy. They're spending their days in the gardens, which a garden is not, like a little plot right outside your house. It's usually up 5 minutes to an hour long walk through the rainforest to a place that's, again, just cleared out of the rainforest. So they're pretty much on their own, out and about. Women have vast ecological knowledge and skills. They have strength and endurance. They have large kin and social networks. So one of their strategies of resistance is their ability to run, their ability to leave bad partners, bad parents, even. Now, that's limited because they can't live indefinitely on their own. As we said, there's really, as all subsistence peoples are, there's a high rate of interdependence. So they can't do that indefinitely, but Shuar women, they certainly are able to leave, even if very often they're brought back. They also have more subtle strategies of their ability to withhold food or chicha. Again, as I said before, that can really actually have significant impacts on their husband's social standing. They could conceivably also withhold sex, though I have to say I haven't ever heard anybody cite that as a strategy that women used. And in part, that may be because there's definitely a general understanding among at least the Shuar that I've spoken to, that sex is women need sex as much as men do. So I've never heard of women withholding sex, although I'm sure it must happen. And they can impose costs on their partner. One strategy that women have available to them, and unfortunately, I actually know personally one woman who attempted the strategy, is to attempt to commit suicide. This is so it's done by consuming barbasco, is a poison that they use for fishing, and women will consume that very often when they're out in their gardens. I mean, I don't mean to make this sound like it happens all the time. It does not happen all the time. As I said, I've known one woman, very sadly, who tried this, and she survived, and actually their marriage is much improved, which is kind of a point towards what I'm talking about, this being a strategy that usually women don't actually die from taking this drug. Instead, usually somebody finds them and forces them to vomit. But what it does is it calls public attention to the way that their partner is treating them. And this can actually end up exerting some social pressure on the husband, especially if it gets her family involved. And that is another strategy that women have to subvert some of these things. So especially, again, if a woman has been married against her will to a man who she does not want to be with, who is abusive or harmful, this is one of those strategies that she has. And of course, also women have recourse to traditional medicines, and witchcraft is practiced amongst the Shuar. They can go to shamans and have a variety of strategies by which they can basically exert their own preferences.
So, I mean, a lot we could talk about there, but let me ask you this. So, of course, we're talking about the Shuar, and I would imagine that across many other human societies, we would see also this interplay between female choice and parental choice playing out. So, in terms of, and now I'm talking more generally in terms of evolutionary theory and all of that. So, do we know what are the relative influences of female choice and parental choice on the evolution of human mate preferences?
Well, so this is where, first of all, I would say, again, we really need to put parental choice in context of it being very much a derived trait. And it's really, we're talking about two derived traits. And by derived, I mean this is something new in our lineage. And the two traits that are derived is both parental interest, their parental preferences for the mating partners of their offspring. So that's something that presumably arose in the human evolutionary history after we split from our last common ancestor with the great apes, and parental influence. And we have to think of that, again, as an adaptive strategy because it costs something to exert influence, right? So if parents are doing that, they're incurring some costs in doing that. So those are the two derived traits. But as I said, we need to put that in the larger evolutionary context, and ancestral pre-human populations or early human populations probably actually underwent similar selection pressures as is typical of most extant primate species, which is characterized more by, first of all, substantially higher obligate investment, parental investment by females than males. And therefore, probably across most of human or pre-human evolutionary history, we would have seen stronger selection by and for female preferences for mates compared to male preferences. And there would have been no parental preferences, right? That wouldn't have even been a force. And stronger selection by and for male intrasexual competition, direct competition, especially physical competition, over mating opportunities compared to female intrasexual competition. So up until we get to, pretty recent evolutionary history, we're looking at probably a very, very strong effect of female choice in terms of a selective pressure on the species. Now, then we think about how the mating context of humans changed. And there's a lot of unknowns, right? We don't know exactly what the typical reproductive context was, but we're pretty sure that it relied on cooperative breeding to some extent, right? Now, cooperative breeding doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the two biological parents that are investing, but it does mean that we require, as a species, we require some degree of cooperative investment in offspring. So within that context, we actually are going to start to see two different things. We're going to start to see both an increase for selection for male preferences for mates, right? So males are going to start to become more and more selective about their partners as they're investing more in their partners and offspring. And parental preferences should start to be favored by natural selection, the expression of having preferences and being willing to incur costs to try to achieve those preferences. So, so this idea of which one's more influential, I don't know. It depends on what time scale we're looking at and which adaptations we're looking at. What I think is more interesting and more relevant than sort of this question of, what's the balance of female choice to parental choice in terms of what we see is to really, what we need to do is we need to identify the specific traits that are under selection, the specific, whether those are preferences or phenotypic features or behavioral features, and what would have been the influence on those of individual mate preferences versus third party mate preferences is really the way to think about it, right? Is even, because we know that too. It's not just parents, right? Extended kin can have an interest. In some populations, the community as a whole has an interest. So, I mean, it's really this idea of third party mate preferences. And then we can start to think about what I think is the really interesting part is to think about what are the contexts in which we should expect to see more overlap, more concordance of interests, right? Versus where are we more likely to see more conflict of interest? And then we can start to make predictions about in what context, if there's conflict of interest, in what contexts might we expect parental preferences to win out, and in what context might we expect offspring preferences to win out? And I think the way that we need to do that is we need to really think about, excuse me, the relative costs and benefits to the different actors in these situations. So in general, I tend to think of it as fathers and daughters, though again, it can be mothers and sons as well. But if we think about what are the factors that are going to influence the cost benefit ratio to fathers, it's things like what is the value of acquiring their own social connections or mating opportunities? What is the value of acquiring social connections or mating opportunities for others, including maybe their other offspring or siblings? What is the value or the cost of exerting effort to impose their will over others? So how easy is it? How hard is it? What are the features that make it easy or hard? That cost is going to be a deciding factor. What is the costs that they're likely to incur from overriding their daughter's preferences, right? So again, in terms of if daughter's in a bad mateship, that's going to have some effect on dad's dad's fitness as well. So what's that cost? And then here's the thing that I think is the thing that has me most excited, what I'm really interested in, is looking at the gap in social competence or social knowledge between parents and offspring. So that also is going to impact if parents and offspring have pretty much the same information, they can come to the same conclusion about mates for their offspring, then that's going to sort of increase the potential benefits, or I'm sorry, decrease the potential benefits of dad making the decision and increase the potential costs. Whereas if there's a big gap in this, so parents have better information or are more able to evaluate potential mates on a variety of factors in terms of long-term reliability or investment prospects or whatever, then it might be a lot more costly to let daughters have their own preferences. And then the same thing, in thinking about the payoffs to daughters, right? We need to think about what are the potential benefits to her being able to fulfill her own mate preferences. And I think in some environments and in some contexts, that benefit might not be that huge, especially again, if her parents and her interests are aligned. Why fight about it? But I think the big place where that makes a difference is in predictions of compatibility, right? Because this is the stuff. So people have been focusing, most of the people who are writing about parent-offspring conflict in mate choice have been focusing a lot on things like daughters should prefer cues to genetic quality or sexual attractiveness, and parents should prefer cues to resources or social networks. I think the big difference between parents and daughters is in their ability to assess compatibility. We just don't have access to the same cues for other people, including things like scent cues, scent preferences we have lots of evidence that both men and women prefer the scent of people they are more genetically compatible with. We don't have access to the scent preferences of somebody else, but also that sort of indefinable thing that we talk about when we talk about human mating, that click, right? That chemistry. We still haven't totally figured out what exactly that is, probably because it's an incredibly complicated algorithm, taking into account all sorts of information about shared worldviews, shared values, shared psychology, shared personality, whatever it is, all of these things that are weighted in different ways that help us predict who's somebody I can just be with, that I can get along with, that I can work effectively with, right? And there, I think it's a really open question. Who's better at sort of making those decisions? And I strongly suspect that that's going to change dramatically over the lifespan of daughters as they go from children to adolescents to young adults to adults. So that's some of the stuff that I really want to look at in the future, is looking at this developmental trajectory and where daughters' assessments of potential mates, when they gain sort of the equal reliability as their assessments of their parents.
And I would imagine that the developmental trajectory would also include, unique life experiences, right? Because, as people try things out with different mates, they also change their mate preferences. If women have had bad experiences with this type of men, then probably as they grow older, they prefer that type of men, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, just generally speaking, when it comes to studying human mate preferences, we've been focusing here a lot on female mate preferences, but I would imagine it would be the same for male mate preferences. Even if we come at it from an evolutionary perspective, we have to take into account that lots of it is context dependent, right? Not only those particular individual life experiences, for example, but even more generally, it would be influenced by probably the ecology, the economic circumstances, social influences, peer evaluations, influences from the family, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of environmental inputs that go into them, right?
Right. And that's where I would say that's actually what the adaptation is. So when we think about mating adaptations, I think it's, there are a few things that seem to be fairly canalized in humans. So things like preferring sort of sex typical body shapes um, is, pretty consistent. But the real adaptation is the cognitive work that's being done in terms of taking in information about the environment. And that's as you said, the ecology, but also the social environment. It is all of that stuff, right? And this is where I said, I think, we are barely, barely scratching the surface in understanding all the crunching of data that our brains are doing, and we experience it as emotion, right? I like this person. That person makes me ick. That's how we experience it. But that's like the output of vast amounts of information, a lot of which we don't even have conscious access to, right? Like these scent preferences, we're not even aware of those, but they're strongly influencing our preferences. And I think this is the thing that when we talk about human adaptations, almost all of them, this is what makes humans so unique, right? We evolved to be able to live in the most diverse ecologies imaginable. We live in every natural ecology on the planet except for like one, right? We live in incredibly diverse social environments that are shaped in part by the ecological needs of various places, but also shaped by tradition and cultural transmission and cultural evolution. And so our greatest adaptation is in the behavioral flexibility of being able to pay attention to the relevant cues across these different domains. So I study mate preferences, right? But other people study other kinds of partner choice, cooperative partner choice, alliances, or all sorts of things. When to be pro-social or antisocial, and all of those. The adaptation is not that in humans that we have some sort of rote response. It's that we are doing massive calculations of
Mhm.
information and then producing on average pretty good responses.
Yeah, yeah, no, just before we move on to another topic, let me just say that that's one of the reasons why sometimes I mean, I'm getting increasingly frustrated by people who talk about innate mate preferences because I mean it's like all men and all women everywhere every time tend to prefer this kind of partner. I mean, really?
I mean,
Really?
so it's all about the level of abstraction, the level of generalization, right? So some
Yeah.
things like we can say, for example, we should expect that women should place a lot of emphasis on cues to are they going to have enough resources to raise offspring? That's a pretty general level of talking about a specific adaptation because what those resources are can vary enormously. They might be physical resources, they might be nutritional resources, they might be social resources. There's all sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily need to be from the dad, anyway. Yeah, it's there's very little that I would say is innate.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about paternal investment then. So
Yes.
what do we know about paternal investment in humans? How has it evolved and what are basically the roles that fathers play?
Hmm. Well, it depends on who you ask, but in general, as I've said several times, I think, the thing that we can, most of us probably agree on is that human offspring, human infants and children require enormous amounts of investment. They are not able to nutritionally sustain themselves, although we're learning more and more about how much children are doing with foraging and how much they're contributing. they're not able to sustain themselves as a general rule until mid to late teens. So they're dependent on somebody else provisioning to some extent. Because we have a really shortened interbirth interval, right? We have multiple dependent offspring at different developmental stages at once that we have to invest in. So cooperative breeding in that true sense of cooperative investment in offspring has to be part of human mating strategies. Now, in terms of paternal investment, again, as we just talked about, right, there's a lot of factors that go into it, and it can vary enormously based on the context. If we want to sort of make a broad argument about what has been favored by natural selection in terms of men's attitudes or interests, clearly there has been selection on human males to like kids more than, males of most other species, maybe not as much as females, but more than most other males, to tolerate kids, to be particularly sensitive to cues of paternity, right? So there's some evidence that suggests that men are much more, their affection for children is more contingent on cues to similarity to themselves, cues to potential paternity, whereas women's is not. So there's lots of evidence that there has been selection for paternal investment. And this evidence runs the gamut from hormonal studies that show, for example, that men's levels of testosterone drop after they have children, all sorts of different kinds of evidence suggesting that there's definitely been selection on men to care about kids, to be involved with kids. But as you said, there's not one solution. So one of my favorite examples, cultural examples, ethnographic examples to talk about is the Moso in China. And these are in the highlands near Tibet. This population has been there for thousands of years. And they practice what is referred to as walking marriage. So it is a socioeconomic household reproductive system that is really different from what we see in most human populations, in particular because children are raised by their mothers and their uncles. So the brothers and sisters are cooperating to raise their offspring, the sisters' offspring. And the fathers of those offspring are cooperating with their sisters to raise their offspring. But there's a few things that I think are really, really important to know about relationships and paternal investment among the Moso. So early ethnographic descriptions suggested that this was, in fact, the title of one of the ethnographic books was what was it? Culture Without Fathers, or husband, Culture Without Fathers or Husbands, I think is the title. And the implication was that people didn't even know who their biological fathers were, that this relationship was completely devoid of any importance. But even in that ethnography, and certainly in other accounts, it's clear that there's a lot of variation. Some people absolutely know who their fathers are. Some fathers are sort of involved in their kids' lives, but their primary responsibility is still to helping their sisters raise their children. There's very strong cultural norms among the Moso to not feel jealousy, to not be proprietary over your partner, right? And yet most people form relatively exclusive, relatively long-lasting relationships. Now, relatively is doing a lot of work there. But what I mean by that is that we're not really seeing that everybody's just having sex with different people every night. right? And never having relationships. Rather, men will say that they've had 4 or 5 walking marriages in their lives, right? I mean, that sounds pretty much like dating and relationships in the US too. Um, so there's a lot of evidence both in terms of men's psychology and behaviors, their physiology, and the outcomes of offspring in various different ethnographic contexts when they don't have fathers around, that leads us to believe that paternal investment has definitely been a large part of human evolutionary history. But again, the thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't have to be just in the sort of European traditional conjugal pair format, right? When we talk about paternal investment, there's all sorts of ways that men are investing in offspring. But
Yeah,
clearly they
and
do.
yeah, and I guess we also have to keep in mind that what we mean by father, I mean, it's a little bit different across different societies because, for example, I remember reading ethnographies on, I think it was probably some people in a Pacific island where they were mostly a fishing society, and so the men would go out for months for fishing, and so the kind of arrangement they had there was that some of the men did that and others stayed home, and so for example, if the biological father was away, it was the responsibility of his brother to take care of his brother's children. So
Right.
and so the uncle would be considered the father as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to the Maso that I was just talking about, they're traditionally, and of course, the world is always changing, but traditionally the main subsistence activities that men engaged in were fishing, which often was overnight or multiple nights on the lake, um, long distance yak herding, which could take men away for a week to several weeks,
Mhm.
or uh, uh, caravans of trade goods on this trade caravan that would take men away for up to a year. And so, one of the things that to me is really interesting is that we see here's a scenario, here's a context in which it would be really difficult to ensure paternity, right? And so, what has developed over thousands of years? Get rid of how important paternity is, right? So, it doesn't matter if those kids are actually your kids or not, because you're taking care of your sister's kids. And we're pretty sure that they're related to you because if we calculate, relatedness through the female line, it's usually pretty obvious. If it came out of her body, it's her kid.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, this view that we have in the West of the nuclear family, I mean, I've already talked with many other anthropologists on the show about that, and it's not universal at all, but is
Not even
coupling,
close.
no, not at all, but is coupling important in human societies?
Yeah, so coupling, and so I was so interested when you had those questions on there because I'm like, oh wow, the coupling paper, that's going back to like 2005. Um, and and although I totally stand by it, but here's the main thing is I probably wouldn't use the term coupling anymore.
Okay.
That was it was just a weird term. I don't even know why we used that term. Um,
Well,
it was 2005. Who knows?
actually, I kind of like it. I don't know why, but anyway.
Well, the reason I don't like it is because everybody thinks we're talking about like copulation, which is
Oh, yeah.
right, which is not what we mean.
Yeah.
But also that paper was a commentary on a Target article that was about the cult of singleism or cult of couplehood in especially in I think US and Canada. Oh my gosh, this was so long ago. And so the Target article was pointing out really all the injustices and inequities in the way societies very much aimed it, and again, society being American and Canadian, I think was their target. Um, but very much about that family unit, right? And so we wrote this paper, The Evolution of Coupling, in response to that. And one of the things that we were arguing is that we should expect that forming emotional bonds that should be a human universal, that we have the capacity to do that. So when I say human universal, also, I don't mean everybody does it to the same extent, or it's, like this innate sort of, now I bond to you, right? There's still massive amounts of individual variation, but definitely if we compare humans to our closest primate relatives, right, we are more likely, we tend to form these emotional attachments. And one of the, so my background was very much in the humanities before I got into evolutionary anthropology. And I was taught, like many other people in my liberal arts education, that romantic love was something that was basically invented in Western courts in the Middle Ages. And that it wasn't, like a true human emotion. And I kind of bought that when I was an undergraduate many, 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 many moons ago. And because if we look at cultural practices, we see so much variation in terms of things like how we structure our families, what's considered acceptable expressions of love, whether or not love is even a factor in marriage, right? So we have all sorts of variation, with some societies being marriages like and this is what that Target article was about, that the romantic partner is the end all be all. It's like every relationship that we could possibly need, our best friend and our lover and our I don't remember what all else, our co-parent, our, all of it. And what we responded is we said, look, there's nothing in evolutionary theory that says that one relationship has to be all those things. What we see in evolutionary theory is that we should be looking for all of those things. We are looking for romantic connections. We are looking for physical connections. We are looking for cooperative connections. We are looking for all of these things, but we're supremely flexible in how we compile those. And so it's true that in, the Western European tradition, we sort of put all of that onto the conjugal pair. But in other societies, we see people taking different pieces of that from different relationships. So coupling, is it important? Yes and no. It depends on how you're defining it, right? When I define it, when I talk about coupling, I'm talking about seeking somebody with whom, and this is what the studies that looked for evidence of romantic love cross-culturally, some of the ways that they identified it is seeking a semi-exclusive or a largely exclusive what's the word I'm looking for? Connection with somebody else, an intimate connection with somebody else, feeling an intense desire for reciprocal emotion from that person, rearranging one's priorities for that person. So that is what we're talking about in terms of romantic love, in terms of coupling. Here's the thing that I think is so cool about it. That doesn't have to be with the biological parent of your offspring, doesn't need to be with somebody of the opposite sex, doesn't need to be with somebody of reproductive, it can be anybody. It could be, you could form that kind of bond with anybody, and in different, and again, part of the environment is the social environment. So we might be more likely to form it with different people in different contexts. But as a species, we are able to form those kinds of cooperative bonds across an incredibly diverse array of different kinds of relationships. So coupling, it's important in terms of finding those cooperative partners. In terms of assessing it, I talked to my undergrads about the gossip columnists, the Hollywood gossip columnists. And it's like, it seems stupid, right? That we should care about the sex lives of people that we don't know and are never going to meet. But people, as as a general rule, we're obsessed. And I speak very broadly that way, not you or me, but we as humans, we tend to be obsessed with this. And there's reasons why we should be very attuned to the mateship of others. Is that person in some sort of, especially if it's a sexual relationship, because we have both potential mates for ourselves and potential competitors, either competitors for the same mate we want or competitors trying to maybe take away our mate. And so we're like really obsessed with information, cues to, is this person already in a partnership? Are they a threat to me? Are they a potential benefit to me? All of those kinds of things. But definitely there is not a one size fits all. So if we say that, yeah, humans have adaptations to form cooperative romantic relationships, that is, in no way saying that, oh yes, humans evolved to have nuclear families with one father, one mother, and 2.5 children. That's just, that's not the conclusion.
No, and that bit about there's not no one size that fits all is very interesting because I mean I also get very bothered when, for example, people start discussing, and by people I even mean academics sometimes start discussing mating systems in humans because then I mean, and sometimes it's very obvious that people who put forth certain arguments is just because they themselves tend to prefer a particular mating system, like, oh, I'm polyamorous, oh, I'm monogamous, and then here's the evidence for humans being monogamous, here's the evidence for humans being polyamorous, and I'm just like, look, just get over it, do whatever you want. And but then I mean it doesn't make any sense for me, at least, to say that humans have evolved as a monogamous species or a polyamorous species or a polygynous species, because it depends again on ecology, on economy, on, I mean, individual preferences, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, why are people so obsessed with
It really is. Yeah, no, it really is funny. And it's, people they're like, and I remember this again, going back way to the dark ages of when I was an undergraduate. I remember sort of being like, yeah, man, fight the system. Humans really weren't designed to be monogamous. Really, it turns out, I mean, so here's how I would put it. Say humans are designed to be much more monogamous than almost any other mammal.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, and we're designed to be much more likely to form long-term bonds and have paternal investment in those offspring than almost any other mammals. But no, you can't say that humans are, evolved to be monogamous or polygynous or poly and whatever polyamorous. I shouldn't say that. I hate the term polyamorous, and I hate it only because I feel like we already had that term, which is polygamy. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's after 2 a.m. here, so I'm starting to, get a little punchy. But to get back to that, one of the things, so I tell my students, so I'm teaching this in my Anthropology of Sex and Gender class, and I do teach them, the primary mating system. Like there are 4 primary mating systems: polygyny, polyandry, polygynandry, multi-male, multi-female, and monogamy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I tell them that, if we look across humans, certainly there's evidence of pair bonding. We've got tons of evidence of pair bonding, including things like reduced sexual dimorphism, all sorts of things that suggest that we definitely have an evolutionary history of pair bonding. We also definitely have lots of evidence of an evolutionary history of sperm competition, right? That it certainly, we do not have any clear evidence of an evolutionary history of strict monogamy, certainly not strict sexual monogamy.
Mm-hmm.
We, in terms of polyandry, right, we basically look like all other species, which is that the populations where we see polyandry, except in humans, we're all humans, right? In most other species, we see these variations at the species level. But where we see polyandry, it's usually because the resources are really scarce and there's not enough for one woman plus one partner to raise offspring. So what do we see? We see men partnering up, and almost always no more than 2, and almost always brothers, right? This is the same thing that we see in polyandrous non-human species.
And that's mostly because of paternity uncertainty.
Right, exactly. It's like, so what males are doing, any sexually reproducing males, if they're sharing a female partner, they're basically cutting their reproductive potential in half. And this is particularly true of mammals, because again, in mammals, they're really, I know again, people are revisiting these ideas of obligate parental investment, but I'm like, come on, in mammals, there's at least a baseline, really big difference. In humans, it's definitely, I'm like, all bets are off, because even defining what obligate parental investment is nearly impossible, right? I mean, should we consider it obligate to get the appropriate social inputs? I mean, I think so, because children don't develop normally if they don't have that. So, I mean, anyway, just even defining what obligate parental investment is in humans is difficult. And then what men can provide and what women can provide. But most of it, past lactation, is not at all female specific, right? And again, our children are dependent until they're mid to late teens. So clearly males have plenty of opportunity to be incredibly important in investing in offspring. But the only mating system, and this goes back to the polyamory thing, the only mating system that we have really no evidence that humans have ever been any good at is polygynandry, multi-male, multi-mating mating systems. We're terrible at it. We keep trying to do it. People really want to do it. Every generation, there's like, a new invention of free love societies or, polyamorous societies, whatever. People love the idea of it and they keep trying to make it happen, but they all fail. They don't persist, and they don't persist because even though we love the idea of being able to have as many mates as we want and the ones that we want, we really don't like the idea of our partners being able to do that. And frankly, males even more so than females, right? So these polyamorous, today it's polyamorous. In the 70s and the 60s, it was free love communes, right?
Yeah.
They fall apart. They almost always fall apart pretty quickly. And it's usually due to jealousy. And again, that's evidence that we do have adaptations to form attachments, to form these sorts of pair bonds. Again, no particular way, right? There's massive amounts of latitude in what that looks like and how it's expressed, but we definitely have adaptations to form feelings of, I want this person for me.
Yeah. And I mean, since I score very low on agreeableness, I know that you want to be a little bit more diplomatic here when it comes to polyamory, but I'm going to say it straight out. I mean, just cut the BS because it basically always falls back on polygyny.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Men do not like to share their women.
Yeah.
So,
So yeah, let's leave it at that. But I also don't want to piss polyamorous people too much, but anyway.
well, and here's the thing too, is I would say, you know what, if you're into polyamory, great, that's great. Go for it. Live your best life. I'm not optimistic it will last as long as you think it might.
Yeah, me neither. Me neither. And anyway, I don't want to make you stay up till 3 a.m. because here in Portugal it's the morning, so not a problem at all for me. But anyway, let's get just into one last topic and going all the way back to one of the first points we talked about when we were talking about the Shuar and gender roles. How do you approach sex and gender as an anthropologist and also from an evolutionary perspective?
So, first of all, in my head, those two things, I really, to me, it's the triumvirate of sex, gender, and sexuality, and they're all associated with one another, but they're not the same thing. So, and they're important for different things and in different contexts, a lot of which we're just barely beginning to really untangle. So, sex is a real biological thing. Are there only two? No, there's definitely more than two, although the vast majority of humans fall into one of two primary sexes, more than 99%. And how am I defining the sexes? I'm defining that in really biological terms, which is, the chromosomes is the most basic, but you can also look at external indicators of chromosomes, which are genitalia, which of course there's not a perfect one-to-one association, but again, there's a very, very, very strong correlation. In more than 90% of humans, what you see on the outside when they're born matches what their chromosomes are. Not all people, right? So again, absolutely, people that don't have XX or XY are real people. They exist. They are real people and they are part of the human variation. But it is also true that the vast majority have either XX or XY,
And
and their
also, sorry to interrupt, but also people who have XX or XY but do not develop the corresponding secondary sexual characteristics and might identify as the opposite gender, for example.
Absolutely. So, and again, I would say that there's still a couple of different things there. So you're talking about first the physical developmental correlates of chromosomal sex. So secondary sexual characteristics. And it is really clear. It's really obvious that humans are sexually dimorphic. We're only mildly sexually dimorphic in size, but it's a very simple thought experiment. I tell this to my students. I'm like, imagine a bunch of babies, male and female babies, just wearing diapers, and no adornments, no hair, no nothing, right? Just diapers. So you're just covering their genitals. Could you sort them into male and female? And some of them think they could, but I'm like, I'm here to tell you, you couldn't. You would be at chance, sorting infants that have their genitals covered. However, if you think about adult humans wearing just something to cover their genitals, and again, remember, genitals is just the lower part. Even if we remove all other extraneous stuff, hair, right? Makeup, any of those kinds of things, any of the cultural indicators of sex, you would have like a 90% success rate in identifying males versus females, at least, right? So humans are definitely sexually dimorphic. And again, those dimorphic body shapes largely correlate with the chromosomes. Okay, so that's two parts so far. We've got, the internal biology and chemistry, and we've got the external phenotypic traits. Now, the part that I think gets into gender is the expression of maleness and femaleness. And this is where it starts getting really super messy. In part because it's not categorical at all. So sex, I would argue, is fundamentally categorical. Is it binary? No, there's definitely more than two, but it's definitely still fundamentally categorical. Whereas gender is fundamentally continuous. There is no masculine and feminine. There's ranges around masculine and feminine.
And also,
sorry, go ahead.
Let me just ask you this, just to see if you would agree with this point or not. But of course, across societies, there's many different ways of expressing gender binary. What it means to be a woman or a man across different societies in terms of how they dress, how they present, how they behave, and so on. It varies. But even if we have a general binary across societies, and even if it's different from sex, wherever it is that a man or a woman means in the society you live in, it's still the case that there's a very high degree of correlation between your sex and you identifying as a man or a woman and behaving and presenting as a man or a woman according to the norms in the society.
Right. So again, there's actually multiple different levels to be thinking about that, because there are some gendered traits that really do appear to be pretty consistent across cultures and across time. So for example, I always show homicide data, which is a really dark one to show. But, if we look at homicide data across cultures, across continents, historically, we see what looks like exactly the same pattern in the data again and again and again, which is this big spike in homicide commission by males in the late teens, early 20s, that then drops back off. And it's massively higher than any point, the female commission of homicide. What differs, and this is why, again, I love these data, because it shows so clearly that culture definitely matters, because the overall rates vary enormously, right? You can look at, oh God, I'm going to pull this from my memory, and I actually have dyscalculia, which means I'm not good with numbers at all. I can't keep them straight. I'm going to try and do it. And this is from memory, so we'll see how I do. And it was like the comparison of the Canadian data to the Chicago data. And the big difference was the overall homicide rate. In Canada, it was something like, it maxed out at something like 30 something, I want to say, per million per year. Maybe it was a little more than that. I want to say it was in 30 something. And in Chicago, it was like 1,000 or 3,000, something in the thousands per million per year. So culture matters, right? Massively different rates of homicide, but the magnitude of difference between men and women was the same. The age pattern was the same, right? And that's, again and again and again and again, small scale societies, large scale societies, all over the place, same pattern. So some things that we would consider gender do appear to be related to maleness and femaleness. And those are likely to be those things that would have been really differentially important to male or female reproductive success on average over evolutionary history, right? So it's not an accident that males are more likely to commit homicide. It's because over evolutionary history, the context of male competition for reproductive success would have favored much more uh, direct physical strategies, competitive strategies. Um, so we do see some of these universals at some level of generality. But then, as you said, there's other things that are like, there's just no pattern at all, right? So whether we wear clothing on the bottom half that has one opening for both our legs or one leg and opening for each leg, right? So skirts or pants. Um, there's no predicting who's going to wear what in what society. It's all over the place. In some places, both men and women wear clothes that have an opening for each leg, and some they both wear clothes that have only one opening for both legs.
I
You know,
mean,
it's
even just in Western society, just look at paintings of men from the 18th century.
mhm,
Right?
right. And even things like, some of the things that we might think of as really like masculine or feminine, like being emotionally expressive. Yeah, actually, that turns out to be a lot more variable, right? It's not nearly as clear as something like the homicide data.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of things that are much more culturally defined. But as you said, what's interesting about and what's interesting also when we look at societies that recognize additional like additional sexes or genders, right? So they used to be we used to call them third sex um oh my god, see, here it is, it's so late, I can't, my words are just like gone. We used to talk about them as societies that recognize third sexes. It's even more complicated than that, right? But if I could summarize as cultures in which there is recognized more than two sexes, and there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of examples of this.
Would
So
an
again,
example of that be the Fa'afafine in Samoa?
mhm. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. The Fa'afafine, the Hijra in India, the Mushe in Mexico. There's, like I said, there's lots of examples.
Yeah.
Two-spirit people, which is the term that's of course, that one's really confusing because it's a term that's used across Native American nationalities, but it means different things in different contexts. Anyway, we'll
Mhm.
leave that one aside. So even in cultures where they very clearly recognize third or more sexes or genders, they
Mhm.
still very clearly recognize men and women as
Sure.
well, right?
Mhm.
So there's no place that I know of where there's no concept of men and women.
And
Um,
also they still make a distinction between female traits and male traits, because
mhm,
even if they're talking about feminine men or masculine women or
right,
two-spirited people, I mean, they're still recognizing that they have
absolutely.
more male traits, more female traits, or a mix of both. Right.
Right, exactly. So it's like inherent in recognizing the diversity of gender expression is understanding the patterns of gender
Mhm.
expression, right? If there weren't patterns, none of that would be anything we'd talk about, right? Um, so yeah, so there's definitely, and and even when I talk about in anthropology, we talk about the gender division of labor, or the
Mhm.
sexual division of labor.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I try to impart to my students is that the existence of a sexual division of labor is absolutely universal. It exists in every human society that we have any record of. But what varies is the extent of the sexual division of labor. So, for example, in some societies, absolutely everything is gendered, right? Um, Women's lives are comprised of this stuff and men's lives of this stuff, and ne'er the twain
Mhm.
shall meet. In other societies, almost everything is not gendered, but there might be a couple of things, right? Like
Mhm.
this is really considered something that women do, and this is really something that's considered that men do. So that can vary. The strictness of the division of labor, the sexual division of labor, can vary. So in some places, it's like, incredibly bad if you do something that's outside of your gender's professions. In other places, it's like, yeah, usually men do that, but you're a woman and you're doing it. So what? It's not that big of a deal. So that varies. And one other thing. So I saw the ubiquity of them. Oh, and the importance. There is one other thing that I usually identify. But anyway, so there is a sexual division of labor everywhere, which again is a recognition of gendered activities. But and the content of them. That was the thing. That was the third thing. The content of them. So, in some places basket making is men's work. In some places basket making is women's work. There are so if you look at Bobby Lowe has identified a number of activities that are almost universally male dominated. And there are very few that are almost universally female dominated outside of childcare. But there are several that seem to be almost universally dominated by men, that include things like large game hunting, and metalworking, I think was one of them.
And also,
so,
let me just ask you this, unless I'm mistaken, but I guess that we can also say that even the sexual division of labor is not completely inflexible, right? Because, for example, there are certain activities like just in the West, up till the Second World War, it was common for people to think that working in factories was mostly a male job, but then due to the lack of males after the Second World War, there were lots and lots and lots of women working in factories, and that was considered perfectly normal. And many other activities that since the emancipation of women in the 70s opened up to women participation, and now we just think it's perfectly normal for women to be doctors and so on.
Right. No, and that's exactly the point, right? That flexibility, that both it can vary between cultures, but also it varies over time. And so, it's not at all static. It's not that, yes, women do this and men do that, and it never changes. It can change a lot. It can change frequently, can change very quickly. One of the things that is really interesting, and we can see this very easily in our own culture and history, is that very often tasks which are considered women's work, as soon as they become profitable or high status, become men's work. So I'm not kidding though, right? So
no,
we look
I
at
was
our
laughing. I wasn't laughing because I thought you were kidding. It was just that
I know it is. It's
funny. Yeah.
And it's so obvious, right? So we look at, here in the US a generation ago, right? Elementary school teachers were women, college professors were men, right? Waitresses were women, maitre d's were men, seamstresses were women, clothing designers were men, right? I mean, it's like we see it again and again and again. Who takes care of sick people in the home? Women. Who gets paid big bucks to be a doctor? Men. So,
and also, even the idea, the traditional idea that women cook. Now you have very famous male chefs, but why? Because it pays a lot to be a famous chef.
And do you know how hard it is for women to break into that really high-end chef career? It's like women are incredibly underrepresented. It's, and again, it's one of those things, it's like, it's almost stunning in its obviousness.
Anything you would like to add?
Did you just ask me anything I'd like to add?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
What we were just talking about.
I could talk all night, right?
We can also schedule a second interview to talk just about the anthropology of sex and gender. I would love it.
Right. No, it's a fascinating topic. And I think, and I think that we're really at an interesting time where we're starting to recognize so much more that sex and gender are likely having different effects on different things. And I think we're at a time in history where we really have to revisit when and why knowing somebody's sex matters. I would argue that it definitely does for a lot of things, primarily health related things, right?
Mhm.
All of our cells, every single one of our cells has a sex, because it has our sex chromosomes, XX, XY, or some other variant, right? But
And
every single one of our cells is.
I guess that even socially, I mean, we have to understand that it matters for people to really be able to distinguish between men and women, because since we are a sexually reproducing species, I mean, you want to be attracted to whoever you are attracted to, right?
Right. Well, in addition to that, one of the things, and it's funny because no people don't like to answer this question very honestly, but I ask my students, I say, if you are walking back to your car across campus late at night, all alone, right? And you hear somebody walking behind you, do you care if it's a man or a woman? And everybody wants to say, no, 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 I don't care, I don't care. And I'm like, really? Really? You
No,
don't care?
yeah, you care. Come
You
on.
should care. You
Yeah.
should care because here's the thing, even though if it's a man, there's almost no chance that he's going to do anything to you. He's probably also just trying to get back to his car and go home, right? But it's a much higher chance that you're going to have some sort of antagonistic interaction with a man than with a woman, right? So even leaving, finding a mate aside, you should care whether you're a man or a woman, right? On average, men pose greater risks. Now, again, does that mean that women are all nice and sweet? No, of course not. Does it mean that women can't mug you? They can, they don't do it as often. Does it mean that most men are going to mug you? No, of course not. Most men are totally not going to do anything to you. But on average, over evolutionary history, knowing somebody's sex gave you a lot of information about what kind of interaction you might have. So, I'm not at all ready to throw out the sex baby with the bathwater. I don't know how that goes, but I'm not gonna, but I do think that there's also a lot of things that, I think more and more we're saying, oh, this thing, whatever it is, whether it's, uh, worldview or parenting approaches, may be more related to gender, to our expression of gender than to our sex. And it may be more profitable in terms of being able to predict and address problems in the world, that to assess people's gender rather than their sex for some things. But I just don't think we're there yet. I think that we're just starting to really look at that. It's actually very recent, and it's still not done all the time, that we even look at a lot of data by sex, right? Across the biological sciences, very often we still don't even differentiate by sex. So we're only catching up to that to be like, well, maybe sex matters. And now I think what we need to do is add in on top of it. Like, I don't think we should get rid of sex, but I think we should be asking about sex and gender. And I think we're going to find that there are some things that sex matters for and some things that gender matters for.
Okay, so look, I don't want to torture you more because I know it's almost 3 a.m. there.
It is really late.
And we really have to wrap this up. And I mean, we have to schedule another conversation just about sex and gender, because if we kept going on, we would be here for another 2 hours.
I know. It's a great topic, though.
Oh, yeah, sure. So would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, the easiest way is to just type Pillsworth into Google. I am blessed with a very rare last name. It's true. I mean, I don't know. You should try it there in Portugal, but usually if somebody just types Pillsworth into Google, I'm the first one that comes up. And I'm related to all the other ones. But I am at Cal State Fullerton. It's true. There are very, very few of us. At Cal State Fullerton, I do have a very out of date web address there, which let me give it to you. Hold on. I have to look it up. This is
I
how
mean,
little
I
I
can
use
look it
it.
up myself and put it in the
All
description.
right. So you can find me there. And yeah, that's it, I guess, is you can find me at Cal State Fullerton and on Google.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And Dr. Pillsworth, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I really, really loved the conversation, and I hope to have you back on somewhere in the near future.
Absolutely. We can do another midnight chat.
Okay,
All right.
so
Thank you.
hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.